welcome. All right, so I'm going to do a kind of reading of an essay. Um, it's kind of a summary of an essay or a summary of a group of essays. Um, the essay or group of essays in particular is by someone called James Paulos. Not sure how you pronounce his name. Um, and it's on the something called the pink police state. So it's like it's a kind of critique and observation of it's kind of a kind of hyper liberal form of authoritarianism. We could say that we live in a soft authoritarianism, um, postmodern authoritarianism. I don't know. There's lots of different names you could give it. Like don't worry too much about the title. The description is quite good though. I was quite impressed with this. I'm not actually going to read from specifically the essay itself, but someone did a summary of the essay, which is quite good. It was let me see who his name is. Pascal Emmanuel Gobry, who did a kind of summarized the theory. But the actual guy who came up with the theory is called James Polos. But I just found this little short article, which was a very good summary online. So I thought I would just kind of read sections from it and yeah, let's talk about it because it's quite good. Like it really is quite a good description of um, whatever, everything from like wokeism to kind of managerialism to um, the kind of peculiar cancel culture or whatever, all this kind of stuff. Although it sort of transcends that narrow framework that you often get. Conservatives will say something like post neo-Marxism or something like this, and it often doesn't really add up. Doesn't make any sense. This is a much better framing of. This is a much better framing of it. Okay, so I'm going to just read out a few little paragraphs from it, and yeah, and then just discuss as we go. Okay, so this is so it's basically the framework is this is why it's good. The framework by which he looks at this is risk. Okay, so it's like risk and risk aversion is, you could say, like the most fundamental and primary characteristic of the pink police, right? And this applies to how is it, what would be a good framework to look at like woke, for example, through, or to look at it's kind of progressive culture or managerialism. I think you could also critique conservatives from this angle too. That's the interesting thing, is that it's a critique which touches upon something which is deeper than the sort of categories that kind of mass media has popularized. And the fundamental thing he's talking to is risk. So risk aversion. Risk aversion is the ultimate characteristic of this pink police state. And now keep in mind, he wrote this in 2014. So this was really, really ahead of his time, because 2014 was a little bit before a lot of this stuff really hit kind of peak. I think during COVID, for example, it was peak. We had peak pink police state during COVID, because you had a mixture of kind of wokeism and cancel culture and this kind of hyper progressive culture. But then you also had this like biopolitical stuff, which wasn't specifically like culturally progressive or anything. It was just a kind of general sort of peculiar sort of micromanagement of everyone's social relations and life under these very kind of medicalized, controlling, restrictive, medicalized diktats, which were very contradictory. Let's face it, didn't really make any sense and probably didn't work very helpful actually. So peak. This is I would say pink police state kind of peaked at 2020. kind of different forms of it sort of manifested into the same thing, And you could easily, in my opinion, you could easily get a sort of post-woke version of the pink police state too. There's nothing about it which is exclusively woke, although I think woke was one of its most loudest and aggressive sort of symptoms. But anyway, the pink police state, Paulos informs us, is what happens under our present circumstances when most people in the polity end up valuing interpersonal freedom more than they value political freedom. So this is a huge, end quote. So this is a huge, very accurate observation that there is a preferencing, and it's not just the elites or something, right? There's a kind of general preferencing. Something's happened. It's the end of history. It's postmodernism. It's consumerism. Something's happened. It's neoliberalism. I think neoliberalism actually could be defined fundamentally by a rejection of political freedom, or kind of redefining, we could say, of freedom. I think neoliberalism was very good at redefining freedom. It redefined freedom away from something collective and political into something which was individual and sort of personal. So a lot of this will sort of bring out, a lot of this theory of the pink police will bring out how basically we're willing to give up political freedoms for let's say cheap pleasures, like, oh, we can watch lots of pornography, we can have dating apps, we can have consumerism, we can watch whatever things we want on the internet, we can order food whenever we want. We have we have this kind of consumer world, kind of pornographied consumer world, post-sexual revolution. We've kind of constant access to a matrix of appetites, pleasures and enjoyments and distractions, we could even say, but ultimately this comes at the sacrifice of any real political freedoms. Now during COVID, I would say that actually it took on a new character, even, that it wasn't even just kind of consumeristic, kind of post-sexual revolution sort of enjoyments at the best of political freedom. It was sort of safety, it's pure safety at the best of political freedom, which is kind of, I would say that this is part of the same ultimately utilitarian problem. Neoliberalism was ultimately it's still around, so I suppose it still is, ultimately a utilitarian phenomenon. It thinks what's pleasurable is good, what averts pain and conflict is good, and it sort of builds this moral framework from there. And that's basically, and what actually happens when you take utilitarian to its furthest degree is a kind of complete rejection of politics. Politics becomes something which is painful. It causes disagreement, conflict. We can't do that. It demands people make sacrifices and take risks in order to maintain or accomplish certain political freedoms. And I think once utilitarianism has entrenched itself enough into a sort of into a kind of moral, like a certain society or a certain epoch's moral universe, things like this are kind of inevitable. But anyway, okay. So he says, of course, to affirm political freedom is always and everywhere to take a risk. It is always and everywhere to put chips on the table. Any affirmation of political freedom, no matter how implicitly, carries the message, give me liberty or give me death, and better to die on my feet than live on my knees. The message may most often be a bluff, but bluffing is the risky move par excellence. Denizens of the I'm not used to reading that word, denizens. Denizens of the pink police state, meanwhile, are quite happy to live on their knees, so long as they can do other things while they're there. To take another angle, Paulos is quite right to highlight that the pink police state is replacing the public-private divide of classical liberalism with the health, disease, safety, danger divide. This in itself speaks volumes to the pink police state's attitude towards risk. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. Okay, so what we have here is the replacement of public and private with health, disease, safety, and danger. Um, um, that's certainly something which has happened, right? I mean, again, look at COVID. It's like, your kind of private medical information. I have to go. I had to you have to show proof that you've taken a certain medicine before you can go into a bar or a restaurant or something. Like, it's kind of like, well, where's the privacy? Where's the Hippocratic oath? You know, um, the, there's a kind of flattening out of the distinction between the public and the private. You see this with social media as well. Like, everything is public. Um, it's sort of a kind of it's sort of a kind of double phenomena, we could say, because everything is private. Sorry, everything is public, but at the same time, everything that is public is reduced to everything that is private. It's not necessarily like we have no private lives, and we're just reduced into like an ancient Greek city-state polis where we have to go to these political meetings and everything is like a free man is sort of constantly engaged in the sort of polis and the management of the city and in questions of war and questions of these kind of big picture stuff. Like, it's not that. It's like our privacy isn't being destroyed by drawing us into some sort of political or theological or historical kind of big picture stuff. That's not what's happening. It's the private and the private and the public are basically just being disintegrated, and what you have from that is basically that the politics itself becomes a trivial expression of people's sort of personal phobias and their personal appetites and their personal fucking sexual fetishes or whatever. Like, that's exactly what happens. It's not simply a one-way street where the public destroys the political. Sorry, the public destroys the private. The private actually destroys the public as well. The public becomes a space of kind of managing everyone's sort of like stupid things that used to be kept private, like their stupid sexual fantasies, their stupid health concerns, their stupid phobias, things that we used to sort of put a lid on and say, deal with that personally. If you need to deal with that through a doctor or a therapist or just privately in your own head, or like write a diary or something or whatever. Things which are private used to be kind of kept there, and what we've had now is a sort of the public space. This is exactly what social media does. On one hand, it makes our private lives very public, but we are doing this voluntarily. Like, for example, I don't use Facebook or Instagram or anything because I don't have to. Right? And I see almost everyone else around me using these things. Like, why are you, like, no one's forcing you to use it. You don't have to publish every aspect of your life on here, right? But at the same time, I suppose it's like they're doing it voluntarily because it's not simply the public forcing your private life to be public. That can happen. We'll get into it, but largely it's also a kind of, people see the public space as just a mere affirmation of their own, like, a kind of vulgar, trivial, stupid, boring, and insignificance. Basically, that's what social media is. It's a constant inflation of complete vulgar insignificance that any reasonable society would just say, shut up, boundaries, keep it to yourself, no one cares. But anyway, this is the point. These kind of anthropological distinctions have been blurred, and now we're in this kind of stupid situation. But anyway, I'll keep reading. Yeah, so to take another angle, Paul is quite right to highlight the pink places. Yes, okay, I read that part. Okay. But where Paulos is particularly perceptive is in placing fertility. So he's going to talk about like fertility in the birth gap here, and then this is 2014 as well. So, this is a really good predictor of what was to come. Paulos is particularly perceptive in placing fertility on the disease danger side of the divide. Fertility, after all, in its natural state, represents an act of cosmic risk taking, the risk of bringing forth and being cosmically tied to new life. Fertility carries with itself the risk of loss, or at least of irretrievable change. of personal and interpersonal autonomy. Fertility means the certainty of sorrow and anguish for the possible. It means certainty and sorrow of anguish in exchange for the possibility of bliss. And fertility indeed carries medical risks as well, reminding us of our body's condition, our mortality, and so forth. Fertility is where human creatureliness is at its rawest and where we are most animal, and yet with our power to generate new life at our most divine. Fertility reminds us of the sheer givenness of life. Fertility is a glorious, smelly, and dirty thing full to the brim of consequences, quite unlike the contextless sexuality of the invariably clean, smooth, and odorless bodies we find in the cosmo and on YouPorn. In YouPorn, fertility, in other words, represents the embrace of life, not as a bumper sticker, but as the great cosmic roll of the dice. So end quote. So he's saying here, I guess, that fertility is if you take away kind of contraception and safe sex or whatever, this is something Zizek has commented on a lot too. This desire to make everything safe, right? Beer without alcohol, coffee with no caffeine, safe sexuality, and so forth. And take fertility out of the equation, you sort of, it's like, you often get this conservative idea that, like, it's not an idea, it's an observation. It's true to a large extent that, like, the sexual revolution separated reproduction from sexuality, but that doesn't go far enough, right? It doesn't go far enough to describing the problem, because within that framework, you could still say something like, people just want to see sexuality for its vitalism, for its bliss, for its enjoyment. But even within that will towards personal pleasure, personal experience, without the kind of social responsibility, even within that, there's a sort of deeper divide. And you see the emergence of screens almost as a kind of contraceptive. It's like this, it's odorless, it's disembodied, it's safe, it's blocking people away, it's distancing the body itself. It's not just, I suppose, like, the capacity for reproduction is just the most extreme end of that. But even if you removed reproduction, even the capacity to deal, like, with a body, with the reality of another body, has become a sort of unhygienic, unsafe thing. Again, like, you see this nowadays, but like with screens, with masks, with I suppose you could say, with a kind of aversion to kind of physical embodiment, with the whole trans confusion. People don't know how to sort of manage and handle gendered and body distinctions. I do think a lot of people that lean into this pink police stuff don't really play sports a lot, or they don't do manual labor. They don't really use their body for anything, right? And they kind of sit in front of screens all day, or in offices all day, So the reason I like this framing is because, it breaks us out of this stupid framing you get from a lot of conservatives, where it's like, oh, the sexual revolution wanted to separate, reproduction from sexuality, because it wanted to oppose, like, the kind of socially restrictive morals of a society, and it wanted to just, experience things in this kind of Dionysian way. But that's not true at all. Like, this is absolutely not true at all. This isn't Dionysian at all. This is a kind of very sort of disembodied and risk-averse form of freedom, basically. And actually, I think there's a connection between the possibility of kind of unintended consequences of risk, for example, like pregnancy, for example. Um, that there's something vitalizing about the possibility of that unintended consequence, even though that could lead you, if you were, that could lead you into a situation maybe where there's more social responsibility, for example. There's more sort of social restriction of your individual personal sort of freedom. If you have a kid, obviously there's certain responsibilities and convictions that you have to abide by. Now, I do take, obviously, I take into account that there's economic reasons why people are avoiding having kids too, obviously. But I definitely do think there's also a kind of basically an ethical reality to it too. That there's something about just the sort of process of nature which has become too unhygienic and too dangerous for us. And once you get rid of that, the funny thing is, you get rid of desire itself. You actually get rid of the sort of vitality and the romance and the kind of meaning of sexuality itself. Once you get rid of ironically enough, once you get rid of the thing which may lead to the most sort of social restriction or social responsibility being put onto you, you actually get rid of it. So it's like, in order to have vitality and, in order to actually achieve the sort of ideals, the Dionysian ideals, we could say, of the sexual revolution, you have to actually include all the social responsibility and the embodiment into it. You can't just separate these things and have your Dionysus. Like, there is no disembodied Dionysus. There doesn't exist, right? Okay, I'll keep reading anyway. And just to reiterate that point is just that conservatives frame this completely wrong. That they say, oh no, we need more kind of social restriction and responsibility and less fun and vitalism. It's like, no, like those things are not necessarily just opposed to each other. They sort of work off of each other in a more complicated manner than we care to admit. Okay, I keep reading. This is also why libertinism or decadence, at least without qualification, is the wrong category whence to reckon with the police state's very strange sexual mores. Libertinism may not be a friend to fertility, but it represents first and foremost an abandon, and therefore a risk. A libertine is a fundamental risk taker. After all, the classical libertinism of the 18th century was as, if not more, concerned with gambling and dueling as with sex. And we catch a bit of the difference between the current regime and ordinary decadence when we think of the current unthinkability of the institution of the duel. Yeah, this is another really, really good point about kind of how Western aspirations towards freedom developed over our history. And I think, again, like, it goes back to this problem of the post-war era and the sexual revolution, right? The sexual revolution basically put sexuality as like this dominant force of, you express your authentic liberty or your authentic self beyond the sort of social convention or whatever, primarily through pleasure, sexuality, and consumption. And it's like, it completely leaves out the fact that prior to this epoch, people often expressed a sort of freedom through things like dueling, through violence, through combat, through something honorable. It's something we've completely sort of forgotten and pushed out of the let's say, remit of Western inclinations towards freedom. Okay, anyway. Okay. Let's see where we go through. So the ethos of the police state is completely different. Sex must take place within what is understood as an ethic of responsibility, as an ethic, even as the ethic ends propagating catastrophically irresponsible consequences. Again, okay, so I'll stop for a second. So again, this is the kind of paradox we have to work through here with this with this pink police state is that even though it is genuinely propagating, let's see, socially catastrophic and irresponsible consequences, like it really does hate responsibility. There's no doubt about it. It's not like conservative in it. Like we could say this: like the pink police state is actually socially conservative, right? It doesn't actually like freedom, but it doesn't like that conservatism being attached to responsibility, social responsibility. It's it's you could say it's a kind of infantile version of conservatism, because I think a more mature version of conservatism would embrace and accept social responsibility, where an infantile version of conservatism would actually reject that responsibility. It would reject risk and fun, but it would also reject responsibility. It rejects everything, really. Okay. Okay. So safety is paramount on every spectrum, and so we forget Don Juan and become Michel Houellebecq characters. In Nietzschean terms, the libertine's attitude towards sex is thoroughly Dionysian embrace of sex as an untamable elemental force. The pink police states it's an expression of Apollo, right? It's an Apollonic domestication as harmless entertainment. Do whatever you want, so long as the risk is contained. So again, it kind of echoes this Žižekian coffee with no caffeine, beer with no alcohol tendency. It's not Dionysian; it's actually a Apollonic expression. It's a very peculiar form of Apollo, but still, it's a kind of Apollonic expression. It's Okay, I keep reading. The writer Tristan Bloom hit the nail on the head when she convincingly argued that the pro-choice ethos is at bottom fueled by a deep and powerful risk aversion, a holy terror of risk. A culture of life, Bloom argues, is a culture with a fundamental openness to risk-taking, with openness to the risk of fertility finding its natural place within this broader comfort with the givenness of all existence. How else can we account for the combination of the sacralization of the escape hatch of married friends? Escape hatch of sorry, I skipped a line. I'll repeat that. How else can we account for the combination of the sacralization of the escape hatch of no-fault divorce? It is always entertaining to watch the horror of the face of my happily married friends when I say I oppose no-fault divorce, with serial monogamy and premarital cohabitation, which are understood not under the lens of sexual liberation or libertinism, but an ethic of responsibility designed to avoid the dreaded divorce. Okay, yeah. So, So you see this emphasis on on ethical responsibility, which maybe we could say is even not necessarily the thing as social responsibility, because like social responsibility sort of has its own logic to it, right? I mean, social responsibility, you can't really just arbitrarily decide what is not socially responsible, but ethically responsible you sort of can. I mean, like we can kind of fetishize our own activity in a way which makes it feel responsible, like for example, like again, it's kind of concept of Zizek would talk about of humanitarian capitalism, like we don't question the fundamental structures of kind of global capitalism or anything, but we make sure that we are a bit eco-friendly, or we promote some sort of awareness, or give some money to charity or something. So there's this constant emphasis of ethical responsibility, which is sort of pushed onto the act of, in this particular instance, pushed onto the act of sexuality itself. And it is often framed as a risk aversion, or at least the risk aversion is framed as an ethical responsibility. Like, you get this from ecologists and people who would say, oh, it's ethically irresponsible to have too many kids, for example, because the world is overpopulated. I mean, that's just one example, right? Um, it's ethically irresponsible to just mindlessly consume a certain way because you got to think about the polar bears and the environment and whatever. So there's a kind of injunction of personal freedom, do whatever you like. But at the same time, there's a simultaneous tension of being pushed onto you, like do whatever you like within an ethically responsible framework, and then you know when you actually encounter at the end of that is that there's something about the freedom itself which is sort of scary or intimidating for people, and the injunction towards ethical responsibility is a way of taming that freedom, as a way of kind of taking out the risk and contingency, which is essential to the freedom. Okay, I keep reading. Once we've said all this, it becomes obvious why the pink police state must be a command economy. An economy built on the principle of creative destruction is a fundamentally uncontrollable thing, fundamentally a risky thing. There is a tension here. As the neoliberal elite who represent one component of the pink police state understand some creative destruction to be necessary, but the pink police state is not about what one understands, it is about what one fears. Think of a man standing on the edge of a burning oil platform. The man's rational mind might know that his choice is between certain death and a merely almost certain death, and therefore the obvious rational choice, no matter how desperate, is to jump. But he may still be too paralyzed by fear to do so. It is an attempt at a power grab over the already hyper-regulated healthcare sector, its implied insurer and hospital bailouts, its expansion of government, its food safety regulations, and what we can call its sacramentalization of contraception. Obamacare represents a comically perfect avatar of the pink police state. I think that's a good historical observation, that Obamacare was like this moment when the pink police state sort of fully asserted itself, because Obamacare was popular among people on the left, or liberals at least, and it was pushing this for more equality, or more fairness, more equality. It was a kind of quasi-socialistic impulse to kind of sort of tame the wildness of and the unfairness of the sort of purely private medical system that the United States has. But at the same time, it was this sort of very halfway house effort to work with the interests of big pharma, big capital, and not work against them, but just sort of to sort of marry and unify, we could say, modern healthcare demands, and let's face it, the kind of overuse of modern medicine in general, because of course Obamacare, so I'll get into COVID in a second, but we could say that like Obamacare, it sort of unified the already sort of neurotic, overly medicated, overly diagnosed public with the big corporations, without threatening the interests of the corporations, or without sort of challenging the sort of phobias and neuroticisms and over dependency on modern medicine of the general public. So it sort of married those two things together, and again that's exactly what you saw during COVID. It was like there was no sort of complete nationalization of the health system in any country. Maybe in China it's already completely nationalized, I'm not sure, but in the West anyway, there was no complete, or probably not just in the West, even like in the Western Hemisphere, so Japan and Korea included, all these countries, there was no like complete nationalization of all the industries and to like just command produce everything that we needed. We worked with the big pharmas, we worked with the big private companies. It was a kind of quasi private public state, again blurring this private public distinction, like states and corporations sort of working together, still going by the insatiable demand for profit within the private sphere, but at the same time providing like more inclusive access with the general public. And something that happened, I think, to the more intelligent people, I think both on the left and the right during COVID, was that, yes, for example, if you were on the right and you were kind of against, universal healthcare, and you were more in favor of a private system, you sort of saw how the private companies were profiting from the encroachment of themselves onto your own private, medical situation and social situation. They were encroaching themselves. They were profiting from that. They were promoting. These sorts of measures and so forth. And on the other hand, if you were on the left and you were previously like in favor of nationalizing healthcare or something like this, you sort of saw how our collective relationship to modern medicine is kind of broken in a much more fundamental sense. And simply making things more inclusive or more accessible really isn't the answer. Yes, of course, nobody should be in massive amounts of debt because they need to have a ruptured appendix removed, or because they have a broken leg cast, or because they're in a car crash. Of course, these like very concrete, observable situations. But accessibility into modern health systems isn't always actually a good thing. It's often a complete disaster. There's often many sorts of bad diagnoses and bad treatments which these medical institutions and medical companies kind of want to try out on people, basically. Right? And actually just not being able to afford it often might just oh no, I'll just put up with it. Like I've got a chronic health problem, maybe it'll just go away, I'll put up with it. That can actually be better today than having access, right? So there's this sort of kind of quasi-progressive socialist injunction for accessibility and inclusion and equality, but like within this inclusion and equality and accessibility, there's something actually worse about that. Right? That's the funny thing, right? These peculiarities, this kind of a sacramentalization of contraception. Also, you see that the more people become dependent on modern medical institutions and companies and so forth, that they can demand government bailouts much easier. It's like the too big to fail situation with finance in 2008. Too big to fail, the governments are going to have to bail them out. We're too dependent on them. And the same thing happens with big pharma and big medicine. It's like, what happens if people can't take their pills? What happens if people can't get their masks and their vaccines? Like, everyone will start rioting or something. Everyone will go crazy, so... Or perhaps they become dependent on some of these things and then they can't function anymore to work or to live. So there you go. Bail me out. Too big to fail. Okay, so next, he talks a little bit about like the scarcity issue. I won't read out the exact quotes because it's not necessary, but he talks a bit about like how we move, I think, in these moments, and again, we saw this with COVID, you see this with Obamacare and so forth. We move from a kind of a sort of scarcity argument to a post-scarcity argument. So in a scarcity argument, people are saying the problem is, for example, that there's not enough accessibility, or there's not enough distribution or something, and that's why things are bad. So for example, you have the healthcare problem of, well, there's not enough accessibility to the health system, so therefore things are bad. Okay, and then you sort of create a form of accessibility and things are even worse. Right? So it's there's this kind of scarcity to post scarcity. You can also say the same thing for for example, the birth gap, right? I think a lot of people will say, oh, the reason people aren't having kids is because they can't afford to, because they don't have enough money. But it's like, are the people with money having more kids? No, not necessarily, right? Um, are the people, and obviously that's a factor, but it's not necessarily the absolute cause. I mean, if you look at Scandinavia, for example, where generally, it's an economically decent place to live, and they have a decent welfare state, and they have supports for people who want to have families and things. Not necessarily that that's actually led to massively higher birth rates or a big change or anything. So it's there's this sort of peculiar situation. I suppose our theoretical conceptualizations of these problems has changed over the past 10 years in particular. I think really in the past 10 years, in which previous arguments of the of scarcity have had to encounter a sort of post scarcity problem, right? And this is what we need to think through. That isn't to say now, of course, that there shouldn't be that it's completely pointless to have any sort of like government supports or to have any public health services. Like, I certainly don't think people should have to pay for, certainly emergency health treatments, or even to have to do that to have to pay for like dealing with chronic health problems. It's just to say that the mechanisms of these modern institutions to deal with these problems aren't necessarily helping a lot of the time. So, anyway, all right. So, he okay. I'll read from this. Hence, the greater the so we go into this sort of scarcity to post scarcity world, and then we have to deal with these post scarcity problems. He says that hence the greater the affluence, the greater at the subconscious level the terrifying fear that it will all vanish overnight, and the need to exercise this fear through the empowerment of Leviathan and license, and the refusal to take any risk that would jeopardize the foundation of the House of Cards. Of obvious note here is the deep renaissance between Malthusianism and the current hostility to fertility. Here we would have a perfect reason for locating with Paulos the birth of the pink police state in the late 90s, the brief peak of peaceful post-scarcity prosperity, both Fight Club and The Matrix in different ways, which Paulos rightly flagged as late 90s penumbras of the pink police state, insisted that post-scarcity civilization was A, an illusion, B, easy to topple, and C, ought to be toppled. Okay. So actually, this is a very good point. The Fight Club and Matrix, same year, I think they were made, 99, right? Or they were at least released. They're, they're giving you sort of dystopia. They're giving you dystopias. Obviously, the Matrix is dystopia. It's not really dystopian in Fight Club. It's more a depiction of an act of rebellion. Which obviously in Matrix is also a depiction of an act of rebellion, but it's also a dystopia. But these are post-scarcity situations, right? Like the rebellion in Fight Club is not for better healthcare. It's not for more affordable housing. It's not for whatever. It's like there's no material economic. There's no scarcity motivation in this. It's existential and so forth. Same thing with the Matrix. In fact, the Matrix is not just kind of post-scarcity, it's also like anti-Epicurean, because of course the thing which keeps you in the illusion is a kind of Epicurean over-access. It's an over-access to a kind of cheap freedom of like, it's not real, but I can still eat the steak. It's not real, but I can still sleep with the attractive woman. It's not real, but I can still live in sort of abundancy and comfort and so forth. You even have that wonderful scene in The Matrix. I think it's the first film. It could be the second film. I think it might be the first film, where Agent Smith says to Neo, was it to Neo or to Morpheus? It could be Morpheus at the end of the film. He's like, "You people, I don't understand you. I've built you the most perfect abundant society, like the Matrix. That is, like, I've built you like this society of pure abundance, and you're still not happy. What's wrong with you? You and he even calls them kind of parasites because of it. He's like, you're never happy. You're never satisfied, no matter how much abundance or security you have, and you have to go and you have to go and take more, or cause conflict, or do something unusual. And of course, the Matrix is a computer program, so he doesn't understand humans. He doesn't understand this aspect of humans, the sort of anti-utilitarian and anti-Epicurean aspect of humans, the kind of Platonic, we can say, or the Nietzschean or whatever aspect of humans. And he even calls them parasites because of it. So it's an interesting reversal. It's an interesting reversal also of the way people used to use the word parasite, because the word parasite used to mean like, oh, people, like there was a scarcity of resources, and there's people who we had to share the resources with, but we don't really want to, so we would call them parasites to get them to go away. Now it's like, no, you're parasites exactly because there's something beyond the material satisfaction which you long for. Okay, so anyway, and again, I think this is a good way to put it. It's a kind of pathological inclusion. I think a lot of the time, especially in the early 21st century, what we're basically discussing is, especially as we move from scarcity to post scarcity, you're looking at a kind of pathological inclusion, right? That inclusion into abundance is the very site of the pathology. It's the very site of misery, of immiseration, of suffering. It's quite a reversal. It's interesting, and I like this point about people, like, one of the problems of, I think this is something in Fight Club they explore very astutely, is one of the problems of abundance is that once people have things, they become sort of crippled by them because they become completely afraid to lose them, right? You have something, and it's the kind of lot again, and I think even like there's a certain, I'd say Marxists are split between two camps. There's a Marxism which is like, the point of history is to get us into a post-scarcity environment. And the point of history is just to make abundance more equal. And it's a kind of vulgar form of Marxism, which I reject. But there's an intelligent form of Marxism too, which wants to look at the very logic of capital and say, look how irrational it makes us. Look how stupid and weird it makes us. Like profit, like the abundance within a capitalist framework is always kind of tainted with this desire for more abundance. Like, profit has to be reinvested to make more profit, and it's a reinvestment structure, and with that, there's this constant fear that it opens up. It's like, you have some money. Oh, but okay, so obviously people are afraid of losing their money. Like, for example, you don't want to invest your money in stocks that are going to crash and lose your money. Obviously, you don't want your savings to be stolen. You don't want, if you have a house or something, you don't lose the house. You don't want to lose a source of income if you have a job. Like, these are kind of practical, rational fears. But there's this irrational fear which comes in on top of that, for example, with people with money, where it's like, oh, you have this money, what should you do with it? Should you invest it in something? Should you buy this? If you don't, you might miss out. You might lose out on making more. You should be buying these stocks. Oh, you didn't buy them, so therefore, you've missed out. One of the causes of the whole housing problems that we have today, the housing crisis we have today, is driven by the very fact that people are like, oh no, if I don't buy it now, I'll miss out because it's going to be really expensive in 5 years from now, or I better sell this now because otherwise because the market's at a peak, and it could drop off. There could be a crash, and then it won't be worth as much in 2 years from now. So people are constantly fearing missing out on the opportunity for making money, and this isn't necessarily a problem of like scarcity where it's like, oh, I fear not having anything. It's like, no, I fear not being able to turn my abundance into even more abundance, right? There's this constant fear of missing out on the opportunity to create even more abundance, and there is within kind of like kind of bourgeois society and sort of this sort of social shame of like, oh, what did you even do with your money? You didn't invest it in this or that. You're an idiot. You're uneducated. It's kind of like it's a pathology of abundance. It's a pathology of being included into the privileged people, right? Again, we see this pathology of inclusion in immigration, right? It's like, people come to the West thinking this is a land of abundance and opportunity and freedom, and I come from a hellhole in whatever, South America or Middle East or whatever. I would be stupid to not take this opportunity. And then they actually get here and things are a lot different, actually. And you see people from some of these countries going a bit crazy sometimes, I think, attacking people in the street, going kind of crazy, having these mental breakdowns. And I do definitely think that has a lot to do with the fact that on some level they regret coming. They're like, what's the point in this? Like, it's just like, this is just, I'm just in this sort of lifeless consumer society, and why am I even here? They have like an existential crisis about it, quite understandably. And then, I'm not justifying them doing anything violent towards people, but, they kind of take it out, maybe perhaps just kind of nihilistically on whoever's around them. Yeah, I know it's these are certainly the pathologies of abundance that we're encountering, and the pathologies of inclusion, right? And the interesting thing here is that we don't really have a sort of political framework to understand this through, because the political framework we've inherited is from this kind of traditional like left-right paradigm is, okay, the left's more critical of the society and wants to progress and change the society, but how is it going to do that? Well, it just includes people more and more and more and more into a kind of space of kind of abundance, but it's a kind of pathological abundance, right? Okay, I keep reading. I think that what we need is to find some way to re-educate most people to risk. Risk is the instrument of virtue in the sense of the ancients. So he's coming off the back of the fact that abundance makes people scared of taking risks because they fear losing what they have. I would also just add that they also fear not getting more. They also fear missing the opportunity to not getting more. So, something I've noticed is like people very rarely today, like let's say their father and their grandfather have a good job and make a lot of money, and then the grandson might inherit that. And does he do anything brilliant with this? Does he dedicate himself to politics or philosophy or a professional sports or something? It's like, no, he very likely will just sort of get a well-paying job and sort of invest that money in to make more money. I mean, there's a kind of infinite cycle of just investment. It's like earning, investment, reinvestment. It very rarely these days spills out into like, using wealth as a means towards something greater. It becomes a means in and of itself. I think this is the trap, right? And it leads to a fear of not making more, a fear of losing it, so on. So he's saying that we need to re-educate people to risk again. Risk is the instrument of virtue in the sense of the ancients, because at its best, it is the relativization of what ought to be relativized in pursuit of what ought to be pursued. Openness to risk-taking results naturally from meditation on the mystery of limited human existence within the context of a metaphysical universe whose sheer givenness, gratuity, and generosity is clear to all who have eyes to see. Hence the proposal I have made elsewhere, and this is not James Pulse. This is what's his fucking name? I forgot his name. This is Pascal Manuel Gobry talking here. 1 second, let's go back. So hence the proposal I've made elsewhere for a reinvigorated and rethought military service. So to be a good soldier is fundamentally to be a good risk taker. That is to say, judicious and radical at the same time. And the military life, even with its traumatizing potential, still acquaints most at a marrow level with the way in which risk, for all its inherent unpredictability, can nonetheless be, like fire, channeled through the application of virtue. More importantly, that risk is a necessary part of all life worth living, domesticatable precisely in its irredactable, indomesticability. Excuse me. If we can keep in mind our previous scenario, where the pink police state is born of the anguish of the mass affluence, we might note that the previous period of mass affluence, the 50s, did not become a pink police state, and it was one of a critical mass of veterans. So he's basically saying here one of the reasons that not all affluence becomes kind of opens up this kind of nihilism, because basically I think what he's saying here is it's like the sort of nihilism which comes from the affluence of the end of history and the end of the 20th century and global capitalism and so forth. It's the very success of liberal capitalism, basically. There's a certain nihilism which comes from this, and also this isn't a nihilism just exclusive to the West either. By the way, I mean look at China and Korea and Japan, and even look at the Middle East nowadays. You got these like Saudi and Qatar, and you got like loads of these rich countries around the world that have sort of adopted certain tendencies of Western capitalism and altered that in many ways, but still have a kind of fundamentally capitalist framework in which they've created a lot of affluence. And look at the middle classes in China, for example. You've got a big middle class in China now, who's enjoying and participating in this affluence. But you've also got a social credit score system. So it's like, okay, so you have this sort of these problems of affluence, this kind of inclusion into affluence everywhere, and it doesn't always lead to. This is what he's saying. It doesn't always lead to a kind of nihilism or stagnation. It didn't in the 50s because of the critical mass of military veterans. So there's something about the presence of having people that are military veterans, or at least I would say this. There's a certain amount of almost like an immune system, I would say, which is quite functioning of people. I don't think necessarily just because they're veterans. I think it's because they imbue and respect and appreciate what you could call military virtue or martial virtue. I think that seems to remedy the affluence. It seems to sort of nullify the possibility of a kind of nihilism coming out of that affluence. It seems to kind of regulate or contain or kind of keep it non-nihilistic, non-decadent or something like this. Okay, so he says, when we think of other cultural means of reacquainting ourselves with risk, obvious candidates: a revival of authentic Christianity, a complete rethink of education, reacquaintance with the classical liberal arts. But military service is uniquely interesting. Excuse me, I gotta scroll down. Insofar as its risk dimension concerns the most fundamental risk of all, the risk of one's life, and the heavier, the more virtuous leader. And the heavier for the virtuous leader is also the moral risk of other people's lives. Because, of course, if you're making decisions about military concerns, you're not just risking your own life, you're risking other people's life, which is a morally heavy weight to carry. At least it should be. I guess you could have some crazy psychopaths who don't care, but for most people, I think it's a weight to carry. Again, the point is not so much to make any policy proposal as to encourage a particular line of thought, and one which has to do with the cultural encouragement of good risk comfort. Good risk comfort. I don't know what he means by risk / comfort, but anyway. And within a symbiotically with that, a rediscovery of the ancient notion of virtue as praxis and the habit of integrating the mind, body, and soul, rather than mere conformity to an abstract moral law. Okay, so that it ends there. I quite enjoyed this last part as well, because it's basically just what Plato said. I mean, this is basically exactly what Plato already wrote, 2,300, 400 years ago, whatever. He basically just wrote that if you have mass affluence and wealth, and you don't have what in Platonic terms is called the thymotic dimension of the society and the thotic dimension of the soul to be well cultivated, and that applies here to military in particular, you are going to just have, Plato didn't say nihilism, but he said you're going to have basically a kind of decline or a kind of decadence. And yeah, this was understood by all the way back in ancient Greece by Plato. Affluence is a problem. It really, really is a problem. And we've developed this very, very simplistic and cheap kind of notion of what is good, what is progressive, what is worth pursuing, which is just more and more and more abundance, more and more safety, and this has caused a crisis of risk taking, and a way to mediate this would be to think about the thymotic aspects of our life and our cultivation. A lot of people will say, well, hold on a minute, why do you need military service if we're not in any sort of immediate risk of war, well, you might need it because it has a kind of internal psychopolitical function. It's not just a response to an external threat. This is the point I made in Defensology. You pick up a copy. I'll leave the link in the description. That the need to cultivate our thymotic psychological and social aspects, in particular here relevant, is the cultivation of some sort of military virtue, and also the willingness. I think the willingness to take risk is really a thymotic. It's really a thymotic issue. I think this is why I was drawn towards this article, because the incapacity for risk taking is pretty much primarily a thymotic crisis. It's a crisis of thymos. It's a crisis of that aspect of our psychologies, our souls, however you want to put it, and of the kind of atrophication and neglect of that part of society. For example, things like military service. This functions to not just protect ourselves from external threats, but to deal with internal threats. And one of those internal threats is a nihilism which comes from affluence. And that nihilism which comes from affluence leads to the incapacity to take risks. And then, this was written in 2014. So this was written really, I think today, because of certain things which have brought issues of scarcity a little bit back into the equation. For example, housing. There is actually a kind of, although I don't know if it's directly a material scarcity problem, or if it's a scarcity which is caused by a sort of dysfunctional market structure. I'm not sure, but there just seemed to be, at least with an increase in immigration, for example, and I think a slowness to actually build things, a kind of a over-regulation, we could say, or a delay in supply chains across the world. We saw this during COVID. There are some aspects of material scarcity which have sort of reemerged in the past few years, But I still think this applies. Like, I really do still think this applies. And I would be very reluctant. For example, I saw a meme. I've seen this meme a few times, and it was like showing a picture of Fight Club, of Edward Norton in Fight Club, like looking all miserable. He was in his office job and he was looking all miserable. And then somebody, the caption is something like, "Oh, Gen X, look at me, my good income and my affordable housing. Everything is so miserable." Because from a Zoomer or a young millennial perspective, this makes, because like we've been deprived of good paying jobs, and I'm not saying this. I'm not saying there isn't a kind of immiseration in that, and it isn't bad. I'm not saying that there is. I'm not saying that this is in any way a sort of something which can be dismissed or ignored. But I would say that even if you get that, you're not necessarily going to be happy. It's not going to fix everything. The economic problems are themselves also contingent on the incapacity for us to take risks, I think. Because if you look at the way housing crises are also caused, and if you look at the way also the immigration crises are also caused, I mean, okay, immigration crises in this context are also caused by pretty stupid military interventions into certain parts of the world, which has basically made these societies more unstable and therefore motivated more people to mass emigrate. So yeah, they are caused by that, but they're also caused by this very problem because, like, take the housing crisis in particular, right? It is a problem of scarcity in some ways, but in other ways it's a problem of post scarcity, because you've got this older generation of people who bought so much property when they were younger, when it was cheaper, and own so much of it, and it's become like this really like real estate has become a really safe investment. Like I think that's the point. Like, it's not a problem of highly risk taking capitalist investment. I think that, like, the actual one or two areas where there's a scarcity problem is caused itself by a kind of risk aversion, because people are investing money in property because it's such a safe investment, and the more people that see it as a safe investment and want a sort of safe outlet for their investments will then take it. So you're going to have more people investing in it, more buying it, and it's going to make the prices go up and up and up. Same thing for immigration. It's like these kind of risk averse elites and this kind of gerontocracy we have thinks, oh no, we've got stagnating birth rates, we've got these problems and so forth. Our GDP is going to come down a bit. Our growth, our economic growth is going to come down a little bit. How do we fix that? Bring in lots of immigrants and then prop up the economy that way. It's like, okay. So it's like, in some sense, it's a kind of catastrophical decision to make. It's socially catastrophical to have a unaffordable housing situation, and to have such monopolized ownership of it, and generationally monopolized ownership of it. And it's also a catastrophe just to have too many people coming into the country from very far away places in one go. But in some vulgar sense, these are actually like kind of pathological symptoms of risk aversion, because economically, at least for the people that have the money, it makes a lot of sense. It actually makes a lot of sense. It actually helps them avoid losing their money or avoid losing the opportunity to make more money. It sort of carries on this this phobia of affluence, which is being quite well described in this little piece. So I very much endorse this theory of the pink police state. I think this is a really good framing. This is the exact kind of framing we need to kind of subvert the sort of simplistic left-right paradigms, to think of these divisions like inclusion and pathological inclusion, and scarcity and post-scarcity, and to sort of really, really mix up and complicate the political framework which we currently view things from. and also to think of the psychopolitical factors to do with, balancing out affluence with certain social and psychological developments, standards in our thymotic capacity, and so forth and so forth. So this is a really good essay, really good idea. Well done to James Paulos and Pascal Emmanuel Gobry, who I've never even heard of before until I came across this. So that was interesting. Anyway, thank you for listening.